September 5, 1938. The Italian royal court is in residence at Pisa, and a decree law bearing the signature of Vittorio Emanuele III of Italy enters the official record of the fascist state. The document concerns schools. It removes Jewish children from Italian classrooms and bars Jewish teachers from their positions. It's the first racial legislation the King of Italy has signed. Over the next 10 weeks, he'll sign more. The process had been building through the summer in deliberate stages. In July 1938, a document called the Manifesto degli scienziati razzisti appeared anonymously in the newspaper Giornale d'Italia, declaring Italians to be descendants of the Aryan race, a claim that would have struck most Italian scientists as nonsense, but that carried official weight because the fascist state had published it. On August 22nd, a racial census of the Jewish population was ordered, the first official persecution act. On September 18th, Mussolini announced the content of what was coming in a public speech in Trieste. On October 6th, the Grand Council of Fascism met through the night at the Palazzo Venezia in Rome and approved the Dichiarazione sulla razza, the Declaration on Race, formally categorizing Italian citizens of Jewish race as a distinct legal group. On November 11th, the Corriere della Sera ran its front page. Le leggi per la difesa della razza, approvate dal Consiglio dei ministri. The laws for the defense of the race, approved by the Council of Ministers. Mixed marriages forbidden. November 17, 1938. Vittorio Emanuele III countersigns Regio Decreto Legge number 1728. Provvedimenti per la difesa della razza italiana. Measures for the defense of the Italian race. His signature appears alongside Mussolini's, Justice Minister Arrigo Sommi's, and those of Paolo Tajon di Revel and Galeazzo Ciano. The document entered the Gazzetta Ufficiale del Regno d'Italia that same day and became law. The man holding the pen was 69 years old, stood 1.52 meters tall in a country that associated kingly authority with physical stature, and had been on the Italian throne since July 1900, when an anarchist's bullet killed his father Umberto I at Monza. Mussolini privately described him as tedious and too diminutive for an Italy destined to greatness. His documented personal interests were military history, postage stamps, and coin collecting. The British ambassador reported to London that Victor Emmanuel had told him personally he'd never had a prime minister as satisfactory as Mussolini. In private audiences, Mussolini made a point of remaining deferential and respectful, which was precisely the behavior the king expected of prime ministers. And the combination, a king who wanted deference and a dictator who performed it, had been enough to sustain the relationship through the dissolution of Italian democracy across the late 1920s. What did the November 17th law contain? Jews were banned from positions in banking, government, education, and the civil service. Prohibited from owning businesses with more than 100 employees or producing war materials. Forbidden from holding land above specified thresholds. Marriage between Italian citizens classified as Aryan and anyone classified as Jewish, Hamitic, or Semitic was retroactively nullified under Article 1. Sexual relations between Italians, Jews, and Africans were criminalized. Employment of an Italian domestic servant of Aryan background in a Jewish household became a finable offense, between 1,000 and 5,000 lira per violation. Books authored by Jews were banned from Italian schools and libraries. Jews were expelled from the National Fascist Party. By February 1941, a state agency had been specifically authorized to liquidate seized Jewish properties. By July 1940, additional taxes had been imposed on Jewish professionals. Approximately 420 further laws built on the November decree over the following 5 years. Restrictions on carrier pigeons, prohibitions on professional partnerships without an Aryan member, bans on teaching dance. The machinery was thorough, and it was cumulative. One technical distinction matters here, and it matters because precision is what separates a historical record from rhetoric. Unlike Germany's Nuremberg laws of 1935, the 1938 Italian racial laws didn't eliminate Italian Jewish citizenship outright. Italian Jews remained nominally citizens. What they were stripped of was most of what citizenship had meant in practice: civil rights, professional standing, economic participation, property rights, educational access, political membership. The legal distinction exercised Italian constitutional scholars for decades. It didn't much interest the CDEC. The Centro di Documentazione Ebraica Contemporanea, the Center for Contemporary Jewish Documentation, based first in Venice and then in Milan, has been doing the work of accurate accounting since 1945, when the Union of Italian Jewish Communities established a research committee. A colonel named Adolfo Massimo Vitale, dismissed from the Italian army under the racial laws, compiled the first list of deportees. Over the following decades, under the direction of researcher Liliana Picciotto, the CDEC cross-referenced Vitale's work against every available archive in Italy and abroad. The fascist racial census of 1938 had recorded approximately 51,000 individuals classified as Jewish under the regime's definitions. By the time Picciotto published Il Libro della Memoria, the Book of Remembrance, in 1991, documenting by name the Italian Jews deported between 1943 and 1945, she had established the scope: almost 8,000 people deported to Nazi extermination camps. Most died at Auschwitz. This is what the November 17th decree ultimately enabled. Not immediately. The deportations required the German occupation that began in September 1943, but the apparatus of identification, exclusion, and dispossession that the racial laws erected was the infrastructure the SS used when it arrived. The laws had been building the file for 5 years before the trains started moving. The question that defines everything that follows is whether Vittorio Emanuele III had a choice. He'd been king for 38 years when the racial laws landed on his desk. The Statuto Albertino, Italy's constitutional charter granted in 1848, vested executive power in the king alone under Article 5. The king was, in the document's language, sacred and inviolable. He retained the right to appoint prime ministers regardless of parliamentary support, and the ultimate authority to declare war rested with the crown, a provision Victor Emanuele had used personally in April 1915 to commit Italy to the First World War, against the explicit wishes of his parliament. He understood constitutional power. He'd been navigating it and weaponizing it when convenient for nearly 4 decades. In October 1922, when Mussolini's fascists staged their march on Rome, Victor Emanuele invited Mussolini to Rome to form a government. That invitation opened a collaboration that sustained itself through the steady dismantling of Italian democratic institutions across the following decade and a half. He had one documented instance of refusal in the entire fascist period. When Mussolini attempted to add the fasces symbol to the Italian royal flag, Victor Emanuele refused to sign. He considered it disrespectful to his family's heraldic tradition. One refusal. One matter of personal dynastic pride. The racial laws of November 17, 1938, didn't occasion a second. Whether refusing the racial laws would have changed outcomes for the 51,000 Jews enumerated in the racial census is a question historians haven't settled. Mussolini might have worked around a royal veto or simply proceeded. What the record establishes is that Victor Emanuele had constitutional authority and used it selectively, refusing when dynastic symbolism was at stake, signing without protest when something else's survival was at stake. There's a detail that circulates in accounts of this period, that Queen Elena of Montenegro begged her husband not to sign the racial laws. Elena was a publicly beloved figure among Italian Jews specifically. One contemporary source records that Italian Jewish women named daughters after Savoy queens, Elena and Margherita after the names of Savoy queens. Victor Emanuele's memoirs, fragments of which survive, claim that fear of civil war motivated his decisions across the fascist years. One oblique source suggests he received contrary counsel at some point. But no primary document, no letter, no diary entry, no diplomatic cable identifiable in the historical record confirms that Elena directly opposed the signing of the racial laws. This requires stating plainly, because the credibility of everything that follows depends on the difference between a documented fact and a story that accumulates around men who needed someone to have warned them. If it's true, he was warned by his wife and signed anyway. If it can't be confirmed, it remains exactly that kind of story. On November 17, 1938, the signature went on the document. Almost 8,000 Italian Jews would be dead within a decade. The House of Savoy is the only modern European royal family formally exiled for a specific, documented, datable act. And the 56 years they spent in Portugal, Geneva, and Egypt aren't a romantic story of lost crowns. They're a slow-motion refusal to acknowledge what was signed in 1938. The war ended, as it had to for a government that had allied itself to the losing side, and then signed an armistice it didn't tell its own military about. On September 8, 1943, Italy announced the armistice with the Allies. In the same 24 hours, Victor Emanuele III and Pietro Badoglio left Rome by car in the early hours of September 9th, driving south toward Allied lines while German forces moved into the city behind them. Italian army officers who'd abandoned their commands begged to be taken along. Most were turned away. The king hadn't told Umberto about the armistice negotiations or the flight plan. His son found out, along with everyone else. For the first time in the historical record, Umberto openly criticized his father. The King of Italy shouldn't be fleeing Rome. He reluctantly followed anyway, driving south in his father's convoy. In June 1944, after Rome fell to the Allies, Victor Emanuele transferred most of his royal powers to Umberto, designating him Lieutenant General of the realm. The king retained his title. He didn't retain much else. By May 1946, the arithmetic was clear enough. The monarchy was too tainted to survive with its most visibly tainted figure at the top. On May 9, 1946, Vittorio Emanuele III formally abdicated. He left Italy immediately for Alexandria, Egypt, where he died on December 28, 1947, aged 78. He was buried in the Basilica of St. Catherine of Alexandria. His remains stayed in Egypt until 2017, when a diplomatic arrangement with the Egyptian government returned them to the sanctuary of Vicoforte in Piedmont. The repatriation required no formal engagement with the question of what he had signed. He came home to the hills of Piedmont without anyone officially naming why he'd been in Alexandria. His son was now King of Italy for 34 days. Umberto II had been born at Racconigi in September 1904, the only son among 5 children, heir apparent from birth, because the Italian succession ran through male descendants only. He'd grown up in a household that demanded extraordinary deference. As an adult, he still knelt to kiss his father's hand before speaking, stood at attention when the king entered a room. Dennis Max Smith, In Italy and Its Monarchy, Yale University Press, 402 pages, published in February 1990, described Umberto's political views as flat and conventional, not reactionary but not driving anything. OSS intelligence assessments from 1943, drawn from interviews with Italian aristocrats who had known him, noted his anti-fascist sympathies, while simultaneously observing that he was fundamentally incapable of acting without paternal authorization. In June 1940, he'd quietly suggested to his father that the royal veto be used to stop Italy's declaration of war on Britain and France. Vittorio Emanuele ignored him. Umberto let it drop. On June 2, 1946, the Italian people voted. 12,718,641 votes for a republic, 54.27% of valid votes cast. 10,718,502 votes for the monarchy, 45.73%. Turnout was 89% of registered voters. The North voted against the monarchy heavily. Emilia-Romagna gave 77% to the Republican cause, Tuscany 71.6%, Umbria 71.9%. The South pushed back. Campania gave 76.5% to the monarchy, Sicily 64.7%, Calabria 60.3%. The Court of Cassation's own membership was divided between monarchists and Republicans, which gives some sense of how genuinely contested the political atmosphere was. But contested isn't the same as close. Nearly 2 million votes separated the sides, and the provisional result was announced on June 10th. Umberto didn't wait for the legal proceedings to finalize. On June 13, 1946, around 3 in the afternoon, he left the Quirinal Palace and drove to the airport. 3 days earlier, he'd deposited the Italian crown jewels with the Bank of Italy for safekeeping. The diamonds, the emeralds, the ceremonial regalia accumulated across centuries of Savoy sovereignty. They remained in a Bank of Italy vault for more than 75 years, the subject of unresolved legal arguments about ownership that continued past his death, past his son's death, and well into the 21st century. His destination was Cascais, on the Portuguese Riviera south of Lisbon, not Egypt. His father had taken that direction. Umberto flew west, arriving in a country that had maintained careful neutrality under Salazar's Estado Novo and had developed something of a specialty in accommodating displaced European royalty without asking difficult questions. He arrived as the Count of Sar, and he didn't leave Portugal voluntarily for 37 years. The Italian constitution that entered force on December 28, 1947, addressed the Savoys directly in Transitional Provision 13. The language is precise enough to quote in full: "The members of the House of Savoy, their spouses, and their male descendants are banned from entering Italian territory and staying there." No exceptions, no expiration date, no mitigation clause, no future conditions for review. The provision also transferred all royal property held in Italian territory at the moment the Constitution came into force to the Italian state: the palaces, the art collections, the residences. The Quirinal Palace, the official Savoy residence for decades, became the official residence of the Italian president. One feature of Transitional Provision 13 carried significant practical consequences that tend to get overlooked. It applied to male descendants only. Umberto's 3 daughters, Maria Pia, born 1934, Maria Gabriella, born 1940, Maria Beatrice, born 1943, weren't subject to the ban. They could enter Italy legally from 1948 onward, any year for any purpose. The constitutional drafters had been specific in ways that created this asymmetry, and the asymmetry produced a result. 3 women who could have returned to Italy chose lives elsewhere, and did so without generating any substantive public record on the question of 1938. The available historical record surfaces no interview, no open letter, no statement addressed to the CDEC or the UCEI from any of the three daughters about what their grandfather signed. The Italian Republic had no formal complaint against them. They had no recorded complaint against the Italian Republic about the central question. What the constitutional provision's male-only language created, practically speaking, was three women for whom the central drama of the Savoy exile wasn't their legal problem, and who responded to that position by producing almost no history on the subject. Cascais in the post-war decade had a specific character among European coastal towns. King Carol of Romania was in the vicinity. The Archduke Habsburg of Austria had settled nearby. Don Juan de Borbón, the heir apparent to the defunct Spanish throne, was at Estoril, just up the coast, with his wife and their son, the child who would eventually become King Juan Carlos I of Spain. Salazar's authoritarian Portugal had learned to accommodate displaced monarchs. It asked little of them, and they asked little of it. And the arrangement produced a kind of stable, melancholy enclave of European royalty without kingdoms on the Portuguese Riviera. Umberto II lived there for 37 years under the title Count of Saar. His wife, Marie-José of Belgium, had reportedly plotted against Mussolini during the war years. She'd found Portugal depressing and settled separately in Geneva after the exile began. They remained married because both were Catholic, and formal divorce proceedings were something neither arranged. But they lived in different countries for the remainder of Umberto's life. He was in Cascais, she was in Geneva. The exact texture of their estrangement over 37 years isn't available in public records. He traveled. He was often seen in Mexico, visiting his daughter Maria Beatrice. He maintained correspondence with Italian monarchists. He held the position of head of the House of Savoy, which entitled him to whatever authority that title carried in Portugal, in the Italian diaspora, and among the various legitimist organizations that continued treating the house as a reigning dynasty in exile. He received visitors, wrote letters, and managed the ongoing question of what would happen to the Savoy claim when he died. His relationship with his son, Vittorio Emanuele, had deteriorated sharply after the son declared himself rightful king in 1969, on the argument that Umberto's acquiescence in the 1946 referendum constituted dynastic abdication. Umberto cut off his son's income. He began exploring whether to designate his third cousin Amadeo, Duke of Aosta, as his heir instead. Neither resolution was reached before Umberto's death. Dennis Mack Smith had characterized Umberto's political views as flat and conventional, not reactionary, but not driving anything. The OSS assessments of 1943 had found a man with genuine democratic sympathies and an inability to act on them without authorization. Mack Smith's method, in the words of his Cambridge colleagues, a determination to hold the Savoy kings to account, not from contempt, but from rigorous refusal to accept self-exculpation as historical analysis, found in Umberto a figure who had wanted Italy to be democratic and had expressed that want in essentially passive terms for his entire adult life. Umberto II wasn't king when the racial laws were signed. He was 34 in November 1938, the crown prince, with no constitutional role in what his father decided. He'd suggested the royal veto be used against the war declaration in 1940 and been ignored. This distinction matters. He didn't sign. What he did across the 37 years that followed was produce no public record of saying that the man who signed had been wrong. The CDEC in Milan worked through those same 37 years, cross-referencing deportee lists against every accessible archive in Italy and across Europe, documenting individual fates with name cards, dates, transport numbers, destination camps. Liliana Picciotto's Il Libro della Memoria, published in 1991, contained almost 8,000 names. The work continued through Umberto's years in Cascais, through his estrangement from Marie-José, through whatever daily life the Count of Sar had built for himself on the Portuguese coast. No available source records any public statement by Umberto II about the 1938 racial laws during those 37 years. Not one interview, not one published reflection, not one open letter to an Italian Jewish organization or to the CDEC or to any surviving family of the people whose deportation his father's legislation had enabled. He died in Geneva on March 18, 1983, aged 78. No representative of the Italian government attended his funeral. He was interred at Hautecombe Abbey in France, the traditional burial place of the House of Savoy, in a ceremony that the Italian Republic observed from a formal distance. Vittorio Emanuele di Savoia was born in Naples on February 12, 1937. He'd been 1 year old when the racial laws were signed, 9 when the family left Italy. He grew up in Swiss exile in Geneva, the inheritor of a dynastic claim a democratic referendum had abolished before he was old enough to understand referendums, and the son of a father who eventually cut off his income when he married without permission. His marriage to Marina Doria was the initial provocation. She was a Swiss water ski champion from Genoa, a commoner, 10 years younger than him, and he married her without seeking his father's approval at the Shah of Iran's 1971 celebration of 2,500 years of Iranian monarchy. The party, staged in tents in the Iranian desert near Persepolis, with food flown in from Maxim's in Paris, attended by European royals from across the continent, at a cost contemporary accounts described as extraordinary, even by the standards of pre-revolutionary Iran, had the specific grandeur of an ancien regime refusing to acknowledge its own expiry date. Vittorio Emanuele chose that setting for his wedding. Umberto terminated his son's allowance in response. He built his own wealth. The Daily Telegraph cited a multi-million-pound deal he brokered between the Italian helicopter manufacturer Agusta and the Shah of Iran during the 1970s. He worked as an arms dealer and financial consultant, building connections across the Cold War-era international business landscape. He accumulated enough that his father's withdrawal of an allowance didn't substantially alter his circumstances. In 1969, he declared himself the rightful king of Italy on the legal argument that Umberto's acquiescence in the 1946 referendum constituted abdication. His cousin, Amadeo, Duke of Aosta, disputed the Savoy headship from another branch of the family. In 2004, at a dinner held by the King of Spain for Prince Felipe's wedding, Vittorio Emanuele encountered Amadeo. He punched his rival twice and knocked him down a flight of stairs. The Duke of Aosta was bleeding when the former Queen of Greece intervened. This is the documented record of how the Savoy dynastic succession dispute was conducted in its most recent phase. And then there was August 1978. Vittorio Emanuele was aboard his yacht near the island of Cavallo, off Corsica, in the Tyrrhenian Sea. He noticed his dinghy had gone missing. He suspected theft. He came on deck with a rifle. He spotted the dinghy tied to a boat anchored nearby, another vessel, separate from his own. He went to investigate. What happened next took a fraction of a second and produced more than a decade of French criminal proceedings. As he approached the other vessel, someone appeared on its deck. He fired. The shot missed that person. It struck a German teenager named Dirk Hammer, who was sleeping on the deck of a third boat anchored close by. Hammer died from his injuries. French authorities opened a criminal investigation. The proceedings moved with the deliberate pace of French criminal justice applied to a complicated set of facts on an Italian island, involving a man claiming to be a deposed king, which is to say, they moved slowly. Vittorio Emanuele was formally charged with manslaughter in 1991, 13 years after the shooting. A French court acquitted him of unlawful killing and convicted him on a firearms offense. He'd done something criminally wrong with the rifle, the court found. But the specific act of killing Dirk Hamer didn't meet the standard for criminal homicide under the circumstances as assessed. He accepted civil liability for Hamer's death. In 2017, a separate Italian civil court found him responsible for the German's death. No criminal sentence, but the clearest legal attribution of culpability any proceeding had produced in nearly 4 decades. Dirk Hamer's father, Rika Geerd Hamer, became convinced after his son's death that the wound from Vittorio Emanuele's rifle bullet had triggered the cancer that killed Dirk in 1982, a belief that drove him toward the development of what he called German New Medicine, a system rejecting conventional cancer treatment that has since been associated with the deaths of patients who followed it. The chain of consequence from one shot on a Mediterranean night in 1978 extended in directions that no French or Italian court ever fully accounted for. Italian investigators, in the course of a separate inquiry in the years after 2002, obtained surveillance recordings of Vittorio Emanuele. Among the material captured, him discussing how he'd managed to evade the French criminal judges, not in terms suggesting remorse, in terms that contemporaneous accounts of the recordings describe as satisfaction. A sleeping teenager had died. A French court hadn't convicted him of that death. He found this, on tape, a source of something resembling pride. On July 12, 2002, after years of legislative pressure from Italian monarchists and a February Senate vote that CNN reported as overwhelming, the Italian parliament amended Transitional Provision 13. The constitutional exile ban on male Savoy descendants was lifted. No apology was required as a condition of the return. No formal renunciation of dynastic claims was demanded. No financial settlement with any institution representing Italian Jewish families was negotiated. No formal engagement with the UCEI or the CDEC or any surviving family was stipulated. The door opened. The Savoys walked through it without paying a named price. In December 2002, Vittorio Emanuele returned to Italy for the first time in 56 years. His son, Emanuele Filiberto, came with him. During the 3-day trip, he had an audience with Pope John Paul II. He conducted a walkabout in Naples. Onlookers harassed him in the streets. The reception in the city of his birth was, as contemporaneous reports put it carefully, cool. Within 2 years, Vittorio Emanuele and Emanuele Filiberto had filed suit against the Italian state seeking €260 million in damages for the losses suffered during the exile, plus the return of confiscated royal properties. Their claims included the Quirinal Palace, then, as now, the official residence of the Italian president, which they argued had been improperly seized. Italian courts found no merit. The suit was eventually dropped. The UCEI wasn't quiet about the return. Available sources confirm the community was critical of Vittorio Emanuele and of the conditions under which the constitutional amendment had passed. Specifically, the complete absence of any formal accounting for 1938 as part of the process. The full character of what the community said in 2002 is preserved only in fragments, but its retrospective verdict became visible in 2021, when it assessed the next generation's apology with language that made the 2002 judgment implicit. Too little, too late. 4 years after the return, on June 16, 2006, Vittorio Emanuele di Savoia was arrested in Italy. Charges filed by an investigation led by Magistrate John Woodcock included extortion, prostitution, threats, and filing false official documents. The investigation centered on the corruption of public contracts and casino gambling operations. The Guardian's headline described him as a man who would be king, but was now in prison for his role in a sleazy corruption and prostitution scandal. The charges were eventually dismissed. During the investigation, the surveillance recordings about Durkheim's death became part of the picture. The man who'd shot a sleeping teenager in 1978, who'd been acquitted of criminal homicide in 1991, who'd returned to Italy in 2002 without conditions, who'd sued the Italian government for €250 million, who'd been arrested on extortion charges in 2006, had been recorded apparently discussing his satisfaction at having evaded justice for the death of a German teenager. The charges from the 2006 arrest were eventually dismissed. The recordings existed. Around 2005, Vittorio Emanuele had publicly described the 1938 racial laws as an unacceptable document, a characterization that functions as criticism of the document rather than acceptance of responsibility for being its heir. His Tatler obituary, published after his death on February 3, 2024, noted he'd caused grave offense to Jews for explanations he tried to give for his family's having signed Italy's racial laws in 1938. The descriptions offered, when they came, apparently didn't function as explanations in the way he intended. 67 years had passed between the signing and the first attempt at explanation. The family's engagement with the question of 1938 can be tracked in 3 data points. Victor Emanuele III died in Alexandria on December 28, 1947. The historical record contains, in the 9 years between November 1938 and his death, no documented public acknowledgement that the racial laws had been wrong, or that the 51,000 Jews enumerated in the fascist census had suffered any injustice traceable to his countersignature. Umberto II died in Geneva on March 18, 1983. The historical record, confirmed by the absence of any available source to the contrary, contains no public statement by Umberto II during his 37 years in Cascais, acknowledging that the racial laws were wrong, that his father had made an error, or that the work being done at the CDEC was connected to anything the House of Savoy had done. Vittorio Emanuele described the laws as an unacceptable document around 2005, 67 years after November 17, 1938. In January 2018, a symbolic criminal trial convened in Rome specifically to examine Victor Emanuele III's role in the racial laws. The proceeding carried no legal consequences. The king had been dead for 71 years. But the Rome military prosecutor stated for the public record, "By signing the racial laws, Victor Emanuele III made an immoral, illegal, and anti-historical use of his powers." That assessment came from a state prosecutor in an official proceeding 80 years after the fact. The House of Savoy didn't respond publicly. In January 2021, Emanuele Filiberto di Savoia, born June 22, 1972 in Geneva, Victor Emanuele III's great-grandson, Vittorio Emanuele's son, wrote a letter to Italy's Jewish community. Contemporary reporting described it as the first time that a member of the House of Savoy unequivocally repudiates its role in the racial laws and asks for forgiveness. The language is precise. The first time. Not the clearest statement or the most direct. The first. The UCEI published its response. The headline? Too little, too late. Dethroned Italian prince criticized over apology for king's role in rubber-stamping fascist laws. 83 years after November 17, 1938. One letter. From a man born 34 years after the signing. The House of Savoy isn't the only European royal family with a record of accommodation with fascism. Belgian royal wartime conduct generated controversy in Belgium for decades. Various German princely houses made various arrangements with the Nazi state. What distinguishes the Savoy case is its specificity: a specific document, a specific date, a specific countersignature, and a specific body count that the CDEC documented by name across 8 decades of painstaking archival work. The 1947 constitutional provision that named the consequence didn't name the cause, because the cause was obvious to everyone who drafted it and required no explanation. Denis Mack-Smith's career, from Cavour and Garibaldi in 1954 through Italy and its monarchy in 1990, was built on what his Cambridge colleagues described as a determination to hold the Savoy kings to the same unsparing scrutiny he applied to any other historical actor. Not from contempt, from the specific kind of rigorous historical honesty that refuses to accept self-exculpation dressed as inevitability. Victor Emanuele III had explained his own political behavior by observing that events were much more automatic than a result of individual action and influence. As if the royal countersignature on November 17, 1938, had materialized without a pen and a hand and a man who had refused to sign things before when he judged them worth refusing. Mack-Smith noted that the king had told a British ambassador he'd never had a prime minister as satisfactory as Mussolini, and noted that the same man had looked at the racial laws and signed without recorded hesitation, while his Italian Jewish subjects lost their schools, their professions, their property, and eventually their lives. The crown jewels remain in the Bank of Italy vault, where Umberto II deposited them 3 days before the June 1946 referendum. The legal arguments about their ownership have continued across 3/4 of a century without resolution. Emanuele Filiberto announced in June 2023 that he intends to abdicate the Savoy headship in favor of his daughter Vittoria, Princess of Carignano, described in society coverage as one of the more glamorous young royals in Europe. Victor Emanuele III's remains came home to Piedmont in 2017 through a diplomatic arrangement that asked nothing of the family about what he had done. The CDEC database of Italian Jewish deportees went online in 2013. It contains almost 8,000 names. The document is in the state archives. The signature is on it. The date is November 17, 1938. Subscribe for more stories like this.